So you're writing a memoir. What is a memoir? A memoir is a story from your life that's based on a memory. The goal of a memoir is to share, not merely tell about, an experience from your life with other people so that they actually have some sense of what it was like for you to experience the events in the story that you're telling them. To succeed in this, you must use strong description to take your reader to the place and show them the people. It's most effective to let your readers speak for themselves. That makes your work more interesting to read and your people more lifelike and relatable to your reader. To do this, you must use direct speech. This is sort of a complicated thing to explain in a medium like this, but there's a great lecture on this topic on YouTube, and if you actually just Google how to punctuate direct speech, you'll find everything that you need to know. Your story needs to follow certain rules to make it believable to other people. It needs a clear protagonist, a central character, and in a memoir that is usually oneself. Your story will have a climax or a turning point where the story, that is you, or the protagonist learns or realizes something or his or her life is about to change. So you have a choice here. It can be something that you learn that changes the way you look at things, or something actually happens that causes your life to change. Your story must have a place or a setting. Your story must take place in a fixed and believable period of time. For your memoir to work, your protagonist, the setting of the story, and the duration of the story must be clear to your reader, or your reader will be lost. Your protagonist also needs to act and behave and speak in complete harmony with his or her personality. This is a triangle that was devised by Aristotle thousands of years ago, but it still describes what makes a story work. It begins, the protagonist is in a neutral state, everything's fine. We learn at this point who the person is, where they live, who's around them, and we get a sense of how the protagonist sees things before the story happens. As the protagonist goes along through time, a problem emerges. From that point on, the protagonist is contending with this problem. The protagonist might be physically trying to solve it or mentally trying to understand it. There are probably infinite possibilities for the way a protagonist can deal with a problem. Ultimately, the protagonist will reach a turning point. At this point, the protagonist learns something that requires that he or she must take action or change the way they think. Then the problem is either resolved, we have a happy ending, or it's not resolved and we have a sad ending, or an ending that is equivocal, where the protagonist is not sure where to go next. The conclusion has to be believable. What makes a conclusion believable is that we can understand how the protagonist reached it. It's possible to get there within the time constraints of the story, and something like that would actually happen at that place. So what I've done here is I've applied this triangle to Langston Hughes' story, Salvation, which we have all read. At the beginning, we meet Langston. He goes to a revival meeting at his aunt's church. He sits there kind of minding his own business, consistently pressured to do what he doesn't believe in, but he's willing to wait to see if Christ does come to save him, and then everything will be fine. The problem gets worse and worse and worse. Jesus doesn't come. Everyone gets up. Time passes. The pressure increases. And finally, he just decides to get up and be saved. And that is the climax of the story. That is the turning point. Chances are, if Langston hadn't done this, he never would have learned what he did that led to the end of the story. But he decides to get up, lie about being saved, just to get the whole thing over with so everyone can go home. At that point, there's no turning back for Langston. He's going to learn whatever there is ahead of him to learn. So he goes home. His aunt is happy and he is sad. He goes to bed and he cries. He's disillusioned and betrayed by the events of the evening. Okay, there's no happy ending. There's no solution to this problem. Ultimately, there is a conclusion, which is that Langston gives up on religion. The conclusion is completely believable based on the events and the time and the nature of the protagonist of the story. We don't have any problem believing that this would really actually happen. So we're satisfied by the story. In fact, we're actually entertained, pleased, challenged. We feel sympathy for the character because it has harmony with itself. So you want to write your memoir in such a way that a triangle like this would describe it, because then chances are it will have harmony with itself. Let me review that with you again. The protagonist is in a neutral state. He moves along through his or her life and arrives at a problem. He has to contend with this problem, and he strives to contend with it until he reaches a turning point where he has to make a decision or take some kind of action. That will lead to a new place the protagonist has never been before. This new place can be good or bad. It can be happy, sad. In any case, there's going to be a change based on the events, and this protagonist will not be the same person at the end that he or she was at the beginning. So I came up with a little checklist to evaluate your memoir. It's very useful to let someone else read your story and evaluate it with this checklist, just like you will do your own. So here's what you want to look for. You want to look for a protagonist or central character. You want this character to be clear and well-defined. I left a blank here if someone else reads your story so they can identify the protagonist for you. The protagonist might be unclear. You might need to define it a little more, and I left a place for someone to write suggestions. If your story has no protagonist and it's a memoir, the story has a problem. Okay, the next thing that's required is that the story have a turning point. You want to make sure that the story builds to the turning point. And that means events lead irrevocably with no turning back to the point of the climax. The next thing in the checklist is place. You want to make sure that your story has a place and that you have set the scene so that your reader can imagine it. And finally, you want to make sure that your story can happen within the limited time frame. And that's pretty much all that's involved in writing a memoir. So I hope, some of you will choose that prompt when you write your Langston Hughes essay. The end.